Okay, let's settle this thing in. Right, okay. We are live and now we just need to wait for Matilda to join. I'm on Instagram. You can do this. Hello. Just telling it to let you come in. And it worked on the first go. Yay!
Who knew? That never happens.
I know, it generally never does. So I was like, this is gonna take like 3,000 attempts, never mind.
It's one of those things that you feel like we should know how to do by now. Like, it's been so long. We were organizing a workshop on the use of social media in archaeology, and we were doing these weekly lives with all our guests, and every single time it was like, how do we add them again to the thing? It's like, yes, organizing a workshop on the use of social media, and we have no idea how to do it. Oh well.
Yeah. Such is life. How are you doing? You're right?
Good, yes, very, very good. This is, yeah, I was nicely on time. I was like, oh, excellent. I'm glad my daughter just had it. She's getting a tooth at the moment. So she's was a little bit upset. And I was like going, if you could just wrap this up within 15 minutes, darling, that would be fantastic. So just to warn you, at some point there might be a baby handed to me, but we can just...
That's okay. We're perfectly fine with that. This is a friendly and accepting and loving family. So
good.
Oh, good. Oh, and I can see a lot of people have joined us already. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you here. And I guess as you're here and we are ready, I should probably introduce what we're doing here today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lily. I am the CEO at Travelusion Tours, and I'm a historian and tour guide, amongst many other things I won't bore you with today. And this is our third episode of Hist Club, which is a series focused on really passing education on and allowing people to learn more about history and archaeology from professionals, because we need more of this in our life, obviously. And that's the reason why I have the lovely Matilda here today. And we're going to be talking about all things archaeology. So if you would like to introduce yourself, please.
Yes. So yes, I'm Matilda Siebrecht, an archaeologist. Go figure. That would be really weird if I'd have been like, and I'm a knitter. And then you've gone, wait, what? That's the wrong Matilda. But yes, I'm an archaeologist and a journalist. So I try to combine those two to spread the love of archaeology as well as much as possible. I'm currently doing my PhD at Groningen University in the Netherlands, and I research Arctic artifacts, Paleo-Inuit. So yeah, prehistoric Inuit, pre-contact Inuit, basically. And I do artifact analysis. I do microware analysis. So I don't dig on excavations. I do occasionally, but I'm the one in the lab afterwards looking at all the things and yeah, staying nice and clean and dry, basically. So yeah, and apart from that, I'm indeed online quite a lot under the Archaeologist teacup, which is probably where most of you watching who know me from. So indeed, trying to spread the love of more general archaeology, I suppose, because my particular topic is quite specialized. So yeah, try to keep it broad as much as possible.
But it's a really cool topic though, right? And like, I think it's something that's fascinating. I don't actually know an awful lot about it. I used to know someone who was specializing in osteoarchaeology and on Arctic sites, which I thought was just like mind-blowing. Because my first thought was like, well, is there actually a lot of demand? Like, do we actually get a lot of bodies and stuff like that coming from those sites? And surprisingly, there is, because ice melting. So, which admittedly is not the nicest way to find out about these things.
True.
But I guess it's good in some way.
One way climate change is, you know, at least giving archaeologists a job. So.
Yeah, I mean, for sure.
But indeed, there's a lot of like rescue archaeology happening in Arctic situations because of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just don't think it's something that a lot of people know about. And I mean, I think in general, you know, like you said, it's good spreading the general love of archaeology and history. I think definitely we have a really, really long journey to do to just let people in and let them contribute in their own way. But I also think there is a lot of value in just making them aware of, you know, niche things like that, because you never know who could be on their way to become the next Arctic archaeologist, and maybe you just inspire them. So That's the thing. We have already a question. Sasquatch Leatherworks wants to know, what is rescue archaeology? Actually, that's a really good question. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, so I don't personally do much of it myself, but a lot of my colleagues do. So especially with climate change happening, it is a thing for those who are watching, and the ice is melting at a lot faster rate, or is melting where it never used to melt, for example. And that means that a lot of archaeological sites, especially along the coastline, which is where the majority, especially in the Arctic, of archaeological sites are, because they are very heavily maritime subsistence based, so they get a lot of their food from the water. So quite a lot of the time their sites are also, their settlement structures are also alongside the water, which then was covered in ice for ages and all lovely and neat and everything, but now the ice is all melting, which means that all these objects are coming to the surface. And because it's been frozen for thousands of years, I mean, just imagine if you get something out of the freezer and then leave it out on the countertop, you know, and that it's not going to stay very good for long. So that's when rescue archaeology comes in and basically aims to save or rescue as much of an archaeological site as possible before it defrosts. There's the baby, apologies. Before it completely defrosts and we lose it basically forever. So it's kind of a form of basically ensuring that we don't lose as much of the past as we can, if that makes sense.
I mean, that must be a really hardcore job. Like, I'm kind of thinking it's like, you know, people who work on like lifeboats and rescue boats, but literally with artifacts. Like, how is that even manageable? How do you know where to be, when to be, how to be? Like, I suspect that is quite a specialized branch of archaeology. Like, I don't know what the process is to become a rescue archaeologist. I don't know what you need to study for that. Is there a particular pathway, or is just something that one day you just wake up and decide, yeah, I'm gonna do it?
I think it's not even that you necessarily become a rescue archaeologist. It's just that for example, in Arctic, it's just more common because there is a lot of the melting. But I think in other ways as well, like I know that where was it? Somewhere in the UK where the cliff was starting to fall down, and then all of the sites along the top. I mean, and then the archaeologists who were working on that, you know, probably never thought they would have to be rescue archaeologists, but they ended up being, because just from what happened. So I think it's obviously if you go into regions which are perhaps more prone to being exposed for some particular reason, then maybe you might have more rescue archaeology work. But I think otherwise no one thinks they're going to become a rescue archaeologist, I guess, and then it just happens one day and you're there going, it's yeah.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because I guess, you know, in the same way we're having this conversation, I suspect if a lot of people probably were aware that this could be part of their job, depending on the geographical area where they may be working, maybe there could take some proactive, you know, attitude to, well, become, I don't know how you become better at being a rescue archaeologist, but I suspect that there may be some, whether it's health and safety features or just generally how to handle those remains or artifacts that you may be, you know, rescuing.
Yeah, true. I think
it's
conservation would be a really good path to take, actually, indeed, if you want to get more into that side of things, because you would be the one that's called on to site to be like, we have this wooden canoe and it's going to start degrading. What do we do? And then you know how to do it.
So, I mean, that sounds like a very sort of hands-on job. Like, yeah, I definitely wouldn't think that's what a normal archaeologist would think themselves of doing.
No.
I mean, my limited experience with, well, I say limited, I've been actually in a few digs, but always from the point of view of being a historian who was actually helping uncover the past, not so much as an archaeologist with actual proper rules. But yeah, I don't think that's one of the sort of things that you ever expect, oh, this could be something that I have to do in the future. So that's really interesting and probably quite scary.
Definitely, I can imagine it would be. And to be honest, I'm trying to think, like, so you have I don't know how familiar those of you watching are with sort of archaeological digs and all that kind of thing, but you usually have two rough types. You have the academic research dig and you have the commercial archaeology dig. And the academic research dig is usually run by a university or someone academic. And the aim is you go in with sort of a research question that you need answered by uncovering something, you know, at this site, whatever it may be. But in terms of commercial archaeology, that usually is when, for example, they're building a new car park and then they uncover a medieval wall. Contractually, they have to bring in archaeologists to sort of check that it's, you know, fine, and they can record it and everything, because quite often, unfortunately, the car park still gets built, so it just either gets covered up or things have to come out, or, you know, something like that. And so you could say that in some ways, commercial archaeology, like that side of thing, is a form of rescue archaeology. So I guess if you're interested in doing sort of things and in a short time frame, you need to be really good with conservation, really good with recording. Maybe something more like that would be a good way to go into as well, which also can be quite, although with commercial, I worked as a commercial archaeologist briefly, and then usually if you find something really, really cool, then it's sort of like, okay, no, we have to like actually dig this properly and take our time and do all of this kind of stuff. So I guess, depending on what you find, but quite often it is sort of, you've got 2 weeks and you have to basically dig as much as possible and record as much as possible before the project continues, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been very aware that, as they say, research archaeology or that type of archaeology can be quite different from commercial archaeology. I think the vast majority of the horror stories that I know from archaeologists actually come from commercial archaeology, which is not, is not, not very good press. But then I guess it's a little bit different, right? Because you're dealing with real life situations like the development of cities, the development of buildings, society, etc., which means you can't just have your clean, pristine hypotheses to develop, take your time and do things at your own pace. You have to actually work under someone else's rules, essentially. So I know that's, at least from what I've heard, particularly hard. I used to be really good friends with someone who ran the Wessex Archaeology Centre here in the south of England. Mm-hmm. And they said that it was kind of like a lottery pot. Like some days you would get something and it was like the most boring archaeologist dig that you could ever go to. Literally someone is just doing like an extension to their house, but they're in like a conservation area. So you need to dig everything up, make sure that there is actually nothing there. So you're not hoping to find anything. You're hoping that you find absolutely nothing. And then, you get along. Yeah. Or then you have issues like what's happened in the city where I live in Southampton. The council recently, well, I say recently, it was actually before the pandemic, 2019.
That's recently, right? The last 3
years. They decided to take down a very old building that was in the city center, right next to the bar gate, which is the medieval entrance to the city of Southampton. And they said, oh, we're going to bring this down and we're going to do new development on top of that. And the entire academic community look at them saying, but you know that there are archaeological remains in there because you literally have a huge ass wall attached to this. Or what are you doing? Why aren't you doing a survey beforehand, right? Why don't you do the common sense thing of actually sending a team there and give them some time to work on it, get some artifacts which will really be helpful for the general museum and culture community of the city, and then do the digging when it's safe. Nah, we're just going to demolish it and go through it. And of course, what happened was that 3 months into the dig, so they just removed the top layers. And as soon as they got I can't remember if it was the actual second or third layer of the digging, they had to stop and they can't actually go ahead because surprise, there is a medieval settlement there. Oh no. Oh. And it's really sort of sad to see because they keep on having archaeologists, historians, conservationists, everything coming to the site, making sure that everything is going according to plan. And well, that's not even to mention, all of the people who put a lot of money into this new development of the city. So it's just like, if things could just be done properly from the beginning, we would be saving so much hassle and we would be rescuing so much more, because I'm confident that even when they were removing the top layers of it, I am sure they missed stuff. I'm sure they weren't as thorough because they were just thinking, oh, it's just detritus. Never mind.
Which is probably the majority of archaeology, is just detritus. Well, really.
I know, right? I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that because another friend of mine who went into osteoarchaeology, they always told me that one of the most fascinating parts of any archaeological dig was the rubbish pits.
Yeah, the middens.
Because you can find all sorts of crazy stuff in there that either don't make any sense whatsoever and therefore really raise a lot of sort of like research questions about the site or that period, or absolute gems that sort of solve all of the mysteries. Yeah. So I think it's quite funny how, thinking about the archaeologists of the future, like literally our our garbage bins could be.
Oh yeah, there is even, I think now there is something called like the archaeology of garbage. There was some paper that was done looking at plastic in archaeology and like analyzing the percentages of it and all this kind of thing, like
Oh.
basically doing a modern archaeological study. I mean, yeah, there's all this question of like how old can archaeology be, and some people say like if it's 50 years ago then that's fine, like that's still archaeology as long as you're looking at the, you know, physical artifacts and all this kind of thing. So there have been some studies of it, which is quite interesting. But it's funny you mentioned middens. So actually in the Arctic, going back to the Arctic, so when I was there on field work again, seems like ages ago, it was ages ago now, it was 2019, but I was supposed to go back in, you know, 2020, 2021. This year I'm finally going in August, hopefully again. But yeah, we were excavating in middens, and that was mainly because there were house structures there, but because it is Inuit, historic Inuit, but still Inuit, we cannot dig in there because it is cultural heritage, which, you know, we don't have permission to dig in there, but we do have permission to dig in the rubbish pits outside. And to be honest, for us, that's even better probably, because we find a lot more, interesting things about, which aren't necessarily of I mean, they probably are interesting still, but they're not kind of necessarily beautiful artifacts or anything. It's more like giving us insights into what they were eating and what kind of materials they were working with and all of that kind of thing, which is just a good way to then further understand the site, if that makes sense, without actually digging up something that is kind of historical significance to the existing indigenous population.
I mean, but that's still, you know, like you said, that's so much information. Like just knowing what people actually were eating, doing, clothing themselves with, just everyday life. I mean, I'm a sort of bottom top historian, so I don't particularly care what kings and queens were doing with their lives. You know, it's not my interest. So for me to actually be able to have access to that is great. And in my area of study, which are the Viking Age, then finding actually what normal people did, you know, all of those absolute pillagers and raiders who were actually pretty decent farmers, just going about their everyday life like nothing else, is just so insightful. Because obviously with societies like the Vikings, we don't have as much access to written sources, and I suspect it's very similar to Inuit cultures.
Yeah.
So you can only, you know, rely on so much on a source that is 3 centuries, you know, younger or older than what you're actually working with. And I just think that, you know, when people sort of dismiss that sort of stuff, like, oh, it's not that relevant, it's like, well, actually, it's the fabric of society.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah. I think that every conversation I've had with an archaeologist, indeed, about like, what would you want to, if you could, you know, time travel, where would you want to go? What would you want to see? It's never like, oh, I'd want to see the coronation of this king, or I'd want to see this massive event. It's always like, oh, I'd want to see how they make this particular kind of pot, or like, I'd want to see what song they were playing here, or, you know, something like that. It's always about the, yeah, I think that's what we're interested in, right? We're interested about the story of the past, and same with historians, and that's the point, right? But like, so you want to know what's happening on the everyday level rather than just, yeah, at the top.
For sure. And I just think that we have a couple of questions in the chat, so let me just catch up with that. Oh, Petra Pro Guide. So this is a friend of mine who's actually a tour guide in Petra, so amazing archaeological site. He just said the happiest wife is the archaeologist's wife. As much as he gets old, he will take care of her as a jewel. They definitely know how to. And Sasquatch Leatherwork says, do you have any problems with Indiana Jones style archaeologists, i.e. digging for money and destroying sites? That's, yeah. Is that, I mean, I've heard some stories about this, but I wonder from your professional sort of interaction with this type of people.
Yeah, I personally haven't experienced that myself, mainly because the regions I work in are quite well protected from that kind of thing. But I know, for example, a lot of people that work in, certain parts of the world where sites are a lot more accessible and a lot more well known, that indeed, someone just mentioned, so the looters and the tomb robbers, so they will go in and try to find historic artifacts to sell, you know, to tourists, or treasure, or this kind of thing. So it's definitely an issue, and that's actually one of the big problems with that a lot of people come up with for archaeological social media and sort of outreach and that kind of thing, because you're giving away this potentially dangerous information. Actually, like if you give away information that it all relates to the where a site is put or something like that, yes, indeed, it's vandalism. But yeah, then you're potentially giving away information that people can then exploit for their own development, which then and I mean, a lot of people then argue, just to play devil's advocate from the other side, a lot of people argue, well, surely it's their cultural heritage, so why shouldn't they have the right to, you know, access it and deal with it in their own way? You know, it's a little bit similar in terms of in the Arctic, obviously we're excavating Inuit cultural heritage, so why should we be the ones that say how it should be dealt with? Why should we be the ones that say no, it should go in this museum? You know, so there's definitely two sides, but you definitely also do have people who are purely exploiting it for financial profit, and that is definitely not not right, in my opinion. But yeah, luckily I haven't had any experience with that personally, but indeed I do know a lot of people who work in certain parts of the world where it is more prevalent.
One of my friends from uni, she actually ended up doing a lot of archaeology in certain parts of the Middle East and Africa, and particularly in some countries where in Africa where are already at war, and you know you are taking a huge risk just going there to do archaeology because, well, that's your duty and you need to do it. They said that it was literally just like a complete chance whether they would come back to a site that they had just started and find it completely robbed and with nothing in it, or whether people may have been respectful. And it's the same for the locals. And funnily enough, I actually know that firsthand, and you probably wouldn't expect this to be the case from a country like Spain, but there has been so many news in Spain of local people going and actively destroying archaeological sites, whether for good or bad, because they would have an issue with, you know, something like a big corporation or a research facility coming and saying this or that about how to manage their heritage. So therefore they would actively go it and sabotage it, sort of claiming, no, this is our past, you don't need to dig in here, we are happy leaving it as it is, why are you doing this, you know, what is the point of it? Or then going and actively retrieving things from the lab that they knew were there, to sort of try to, you know, tamper with the evidence and stuff like that. And it's happened a lot in the recent years since the law of historical memory came through because of the Spanish Civil War. So there is a lot of mass graves, right, that are not necessarily marked, but if you are local and your family has been in the area forever, you unfortunately know who was being buried roughly in what part. So particularly with certain political ideologies, and actually there is been fault on both sides, so it's not like it's one or the other that's worse or better. There has been situations where they knew that the government had a team coming through, the team would arrive, and suddenly the remains of 20 people just disappear. And that's like, I can understand why you may want to protect your community, but at the same time, you're causing harm because, you know, those people now, you know, they're no longer going to be in a place where they belong. They are no longer going to be able to be recognized, particularly in mass burials. You know, it's you with however many other people. How is your family ever going to know what happened to you? You know, in a country that is quite religious like Spain, people really care about that stuff as well. So it just adds so many levels of like ethics, morals that just kind of transcend anything. That I just kind of really struggle with these things because, like you said, if you sort of go on the side of the locals or the communities that are affected by this, you have to sympathize with them to an extent, but then it becomes a matter of, you know, who makes the rules, who's actually looking after these remains, after this culture, after these objects, and why is it being policed in one way and not another?
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes the rules are there for a reason, but I've also become aware of cases where, we're going to take all of this with us. You're never going to have access to it. You're never going to see it again. And it's not going to be for the benefit of the community. And it's a very rocky situation, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's very important indeed to communicate why you're doing what you're doing and to the public, and also make it relevant to the modern society. I think especially in archaeology, I don't know if it's similar in history, but the sort of classic traditional archaeology was, you know, basically some lord being like, oh, I want this for my cabinet of curiosities. And that did stay like quite, you know, for a surprisingly long amount of time, like within the discipline. I would hope that now it's different and, you know, we're changing and we're not just looking at the past for the sake of looking at the past. We're looking at the past in order to educate ourselves about the present and the future. You know, I mean, that's the point of archaeology, right? Like, it has to be relevant in some way. But I think indeed a lot of the times there's a communication error, and you have to, yeah, indeed make sure to communicate why you're doing what you're doing and why it is relevant to the community whose history and heritage it is, and not just for their sake but also for yours, to make sure that you stay on track in the way. I think that makes which is especially the case when working, for example, with indigenous populations like in the Arctic. All archaeology is done at the behest or at the wishes of the local Inuit population. You know, there's no more, or there shouldn't be any more. There probably is in some places, like helicopter archaeology, where, you know, you come in, take some stuff and go out again. It should all be in collaboration with, it should all be, you know, arranged in such a way that they have stated what they find important, and therefore your research questions need to fall within that, rather than us coming as an outsider and deciding what we think their heritage should be or how it should be, yeah, based with. So I think, yeah, just communication between all parties is indeed essential, because otherwise, like you say, that can happen, that people just don't trust archaeologists, or they don't trust the government, or, you know, that kind of things, just because, yeah, it has had a bad history. I guess, and archaeology has had a bad history. Inception. But yeah.
So it's interesting. I was just reading Sasquatch Leatherworks' comment that there is a place in northern Saskatchewan in Canada that has actually to be located between maps because of this issue of looters and etc.
Yeah.
Give important information out all the time, 100%, because, you know, there is nothing worse than, you know, being out in the dark for the communities, because I think we sometimes tend to forget that as much as we live in a modern society, rural communities and places who are not connected to a city are still very much traditional. You know, things have modernized themselves, but the values of that society and the type of things that matter to those places are the same that they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So if you are not actively sort of thinking about that, then you're really at risk of really jeopardizing things for the future, like you said. I think we normally tend to think that a lot of these decisions happen in an urbanized modern society, not necessarily, you know, in secluded communities or indigenous populations, etc. And I think that's really where, I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, but I would be super interested to find out more. And where the whole sort of new policies about diversity and inclusion in archaeology, I think, are super important. And having people from those specific communities, hopefully, if they are professionally trained, actually getting access to these sites. And if they are not professionally trained, then obviously we should be doing something about this and getting more people from these secluded communities into the general academic studies of archaeology and history. But yeah, I don't know if you've ever had encountered anything with this or know much about how archaeology is evolving on this end, because I think it's very important.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, I don't know about in different parts of the world, but for example, in the Arctic, so obviously, ideally, all the archaeology there would be run by local Inuit. That would, you know, we wouldn't have to go in. We'd maybe go in to like consult on specialist things if they need something in particular. The problem is, in order to excavate, in order to have a research permit to excavate in the Arctic, and you can only allow to go up into the Arctic with this research permit and do your research there if you have it, you have to have an archaeology degree. In order to get an archaeology degree, you have to go to a university that has an archaeology degree. In Canada, all of the universities with archaeology degrees are located not in the Arctic. There aren't any universities in the Arctic which offer that as a solution. Therefore, if, for example, a young Inuit woman wanted to go and study archaeology, she would have to leave not just her family and her homeland and everything, which people probably watching and going, yeah, but we've all done that, it's fine. It's like, yeah, but you weren't forced to do that necessarily.
Yeah.
That's her only option, is to go and do that. And I don't know how many people know what the Arctic landscape looks like, but it's very wide open, beautiful landscape, lots of nature, very small communities, very family based. You often have multiple generations of the single family living in one house, so it's very family oriented. If you then have to leave all that and go to a busy city full of people you don't know, full of very different culture, that's a big step to take. So it's very rare that people do it, quite frankly. And so I think that, yeah, unfortunately, there's only so much that as archaeologists you can do at that level, because you have to change. I mean, you have to change at such a higher level. Yeah. You have to make it more approachable and more accessible, or you have to change the policy. So I'm hoping, for example, in future, if I continue doing Arctic archaeology in the future, I'm hoping to, because at the moment I'm one of the very, very few Arctic people doing microwear analysis. There's only a handful of us, which, considering the size of Arctic Canada, you know, like I can count them on one hand, you know, and that's not, and none of them, well, which is great for me in terms of job prospects, but in terms of the morals and ethics of, indeed, you know, should I, as a, you know, West European person, really be coming in and being the only person who's specialized in that kind of thing? So the hope is that some kind of capacity building is built up, which then means that, yes, maybe perhaps the Inuit who are then specialized in that will not be able to have their own archaeological excavation, but they will be able to work as consultants, or they will be able to have some other kind of training prospects that doesn't involve them having to leave their homes in order to do it, which hopefully we'll see anyway, but it depends on funding. But I think a lot of the times the problem with this kind of thing, and including diversity, is that for the what's the word, the road to becoming an archaeologist, or the road to being able to run your own excavation, is still very much focused for a particular class of society who are able to travel and get educated and can afford to do that. And I think that is the main, one of the central problems with it, really.
Yeah, and you know, for those of you watching at home, this is not something that is just like exclusive to things like Arctic communities. I think just the impact there is more because of, well, their general lifestyle, etc. But for example, just a quick analysis of the UK, and I'm talking, you know, of a Western European country with a huge amount of, you know, research departments, etc., focused on archaeology. Archaeology is one of the degrees in the UK that has a pretty high intake, although actually it's gone down over the years because of the following problem, which is that I think it's something insane, like only 20% of people with an archaeology degree will ever actually be able to pursue a career in archaeology. And if you look at that 20%, it's very obvious to what part of society, what even parts of geography, etc., where they come from. There are, of course, some exceptions, and that normally comes at the expense of people being incredibly talented, fighting their battles, you know, finding support within communities for research, etc., out of their own pockets and out of their own free will. So even though the humanities always sort of seem to be a place for everybody, we have a lot of work to do to sort of, you know, even up the field. And it's something that, it's changing, but I think it's slow. And I will always remember when I was doing my research and I went to Norway to, well, just get actually, you know, groundwork experience on Viking sites in there and how Viking culture is still understood by society, etc. I was very, very proactive into understanding how the Sami actually dealt with this heritage and their perception through history, etc. And the Norwegian government is actually pretty good, or at least it's become pretty good in the last few years, to actually make sure that there is educational centers, etc., in the nomadic route for the Sami communities, precisely so that what you are describing doesn't have to happen, and so that a lot of young, because particularly I think it affects more young women, they don't have to, you know, leave their lifestyle, culture, etc., just to learn something that adds value to their own community. And I mean, their concerns may not be specifically with archaeology, but I remember a case study particularly of a young woman who wanted to learn more about sustainable conservation of reindeers, which makes perfect sense because that's what their community do. But for that, you know, she had to go all the way to Oslo, which is not not even subarctic. It's far away, and particularly in a country like Norway, where the just geography makes it impossible to go from one end to the other. It is a lot of miles. It is very difficult, and you shouldn't have to do that just to be able to learn something that will help yourself and your own community. So,
and that is relevant to your community as well. Like you say, it's not as if she was interested in Roman prehistory or something. She's interested in something that directly affects her, so it should be available to.
So, you know, there is certainly a lot of work that needs to be done, but I hope that we're taking the right steps to fix this. Hope. Fingers crossed.
Well, and I think that there is a lot of potential, because especially in something like archaeology, it's such an international discipline. And actually, I think it's really beneficial if you have had experience. So like my undergrad and my master's was in European prehistory, and then now I've gone to the Arctic, and it's very different. But I think it was actually good for me to have that background, because it made me realize what I was lacking, for example, in what you learn in European, for example, with indigenous archaeology, but also it made me realize certain things about Arctic archaeology that can learn from the European side of things. So I think that actually you don't have to always analyze your own culture. We've been talking about this a lot, but it's not obligatory. Obviously, it's great because you have that history already inside you, and you have those connections already. So it is good, and obviously we should ensure that those people who want to can, which is what we were just talking about. But at the same time, for example, an immigrant to the UK who is interested in learning about British archaeology and wants to continue a career in researching that shouldn't have to sort of fight more than a British person who wants to do it, for example. Like you should have the right to study whoever you want to study, as long as you do it in a way, like you say, that's ethical and that is acceptable
and 100% you've just summarized my academic life in one sentence, because I originally come from Spain, I study in the UK, and I study the Vikings. So obviously, as much as there is Viking inheritance in the UK, which is super important, my main areas of expertise have not been the UK, they've been the actual Nordic countries. But people just don't sort of realize that I'm not doing this to sort of appropriate Viking culture. I'm actually trying to demystify what Nordic people already know to the rest of Europe, because there are so many misconceptions. But it is funny because whichever end you are, you always seem to have to justify yourself, which I never thought I would have to be. If you are, from wherever you are, say you're German and you want to study German history and do German archaeology because that's your homeland, your country, your passion, and you know about it and you want to make it better, go for it. But at the same time, if you are a German professional and want to help the indigenous communities of, I don't know, New Zealand or Australia to get more visible and to get that support, then you should be able to obviously do it in a way that is respectful and that will be for the benefit, both of German people, because they will be able to learn a lot more about those communities, which will be great, and for those indigenous people who will then get access to all of that stuff that we may have in Europe and that they may not do. So it is just interesting how polarizing this field is. And I just think a lot of people don't know about that. So thank you for actually talking, bringing that up to attention, because I think when we were talking about the whole Indiana Jones stuff, I always sort of think that's what most people think archaeology is, right? You go places, you find shiny things, you loot them, or you take them to a museum, and you're cool, and that's fine. But actually, there is a lot of cultural, political subtext that go into everything that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, you're actually handling things that people made, or people themselves from however many years ago, and it's even worse than if you were doing that in the present, because you need to apply present rules to a society that didn't necessarily have those rules, and vice versa. So the layers are just everywhere, and it is hard to engage with it, I think, and I think maybe that's one of the reasons why people think it may be a bit more inaccessible, because you're not always necessarily aware of all of those sort of tiptoes that you need to do around.
And even that's not even mentioning all the political side of things, where you have to be, everyone thinks that they know everything that happened in the past, right? And so you have all kinds of things that are, both historically but also in the present day, that sort of say, no, but we can do this because look, they did this thousands of years ago, and there's a load of archaeologists and historians in the background going, actually, I think if you look at there's this one paper that suggested that maybe this could have happened, but that's not the final answer. So I think that's also something that needs to be made more, and that's what I'm trying to do through my channel mainly, is kind of showing people that okay, this is one hypothesis, but actually we don't really know. That's the end of the day story. But still, it's important to be aware of the possibilities, because that's also it's a complicated subject.
I'm becoming aware of the fact that we have 6 minutes to go, and I really wanted to ask you about it.
Oh, sorry.
So in summary, could you tell us a bit more as to why you actually started doing what you do, and this Instagram channel in particular? Because I think, like you said, there is so much value for people to be able to know this is just perhaps the accepted theory, but that doesn't mean that there are many other possibilities. Because that's something that, as a scholar who is very interdisciplinary, I suffer from a lot. Like, in my field, the rules are this, and as soon as you sort of move away from that, people look at you like you're just mad.
Yeah.
Even though there may be evidence, ample evidence, to suggest that you may have a point. So, yeah, why did you decide that, you know what, I'm just going to throw some thoughts there to people to deal with it and actually allow them to think for themselves, right?
Well, that was the main point I wanted to make, because I mean, I can't even remember when I started it, but for example, I mean, you're probably aware of this in the UK, so many university archaeology departments are being cut because of funding cuts, and generally archaeology is one of the first to go, just because people don't know what we do. Like you were saying, you know, they have all these assumptions. They think Indiana Jones, dinosaurs, what's your favorite treasure, like, or I had this lovely conversation with one woman at some point, and I was going, why is she asking me about like building facades? And you know, I'm not doing that. And then I realized she thought I was an architect. You know, like, there's so many stereotypes or unrelated assumptions about archaeology. So then I think that makes sense that then, you know, if someone who doesn't actually know what an archaeologist does is looking at like a list of potential departments to cut and goes, well, they just dig up stuff and, you know, look at the, like, what, okay, yeah, that one's going. So you have to show, no, okay, yes, we're looking at stuff that happened in the past, but why are we looking at stuff that happened in the past? And indeed, I think with archaeology, one of the big things for me that I love about archaeology is this idea, and especially I focus more on prehistoric archaeology, so I guess very different to what you're doing as well. You mentioned that the Vikings don't have much historic records, but you know, well, indeed, my cultures I study have nothing. Like,
people don't even.
There's nothing, and so that means that, I mean, on the one hand, there's so many possibilities because, you know, the sky's the limit basically, but then no, it's not the limit. The ground's the limit, because it's what you find in the ground that you have to base your assumptions on. So on the one hand, it teaches you, like, no, you can't just make wild comments. You have to actually base it on something physical, something that has evidence, you have evidence for. But on the other hand, the way that, and I mean, this is what I remember my mind being blown, like in my undergrad archaeology class, with our professor sort of basically saying to us, like, the dead don't bury themselves. You know, so when you find a grave and you're then making all these assumptions about this person, then someone says to you, yes, so no, actually, like, that person probably didn't write a long list of being like, this is how I want to be buried. Like, the people put them there. So actually what you're seeing are the interpretations of that person of prehistoric people. But actually your interpretations of those interpretations are purely based on your own experience as a modern Western woman, you know, living in a first world country or whatever. So that idea that everything we think and everything we interpret and everything we do is so biased, not through any fault of our own, it's just, that's how it happens, right? Like, we can't live in anyone else's shoes. I mean, it's all these things of archaeology. It's like, oh, we're trying to live in people's shoes in the past. And I think that we are trying, but we can't really. And that's a whole theoretical thing. There's all sorts of different theoretical discussions in archaeology about how useful it is to do these different things. But I mean, I think that one of the best things is that we can then understand that, yes, we are biased, and yes, how we look at how other people live, either in the past or in the present, is purely based on our own interpretations, and those interpretations are very biased as well. So, sorry, this was a long ramble, but like, basically that was what I wanted to sort of show through this channel is, like, inspire an interest in archaeology, you know, through looking at things. I saw someone being like, Antikythera mechanism. I'm like, yes, if you want more information, check out my reels, because I made a reel all about that. And yeah, I have all these lovely replicas on here that I make little reels about to show people what happened in the past. But I try to, with all of those reels, also show a little bit about, like, okay, but, you know, why is this important? And like, why should we know about this? And how does this relate to us now? Not just in terms of like, why is the past important to us, but also like, why is how we think about the past important? And why is, you know, how do we think about the past? And how does this relate to how we think about the present? So yeah, it's inspiring archaeology and interest in archaeology, but also trying to make people realize that they shouldn't just trust the first thing they read about the past, and hopefully that then expands further out. So I mean, I believe that archaeology is a discipline in itself in terms of studying the past, but also it's a way of thinking, which I think is very good. So obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. So yeah, sorry, that was a really
no, it's great. And actually, I'm gonna piggyback on that and say something really controversial, but well, I'm past this. Don't believe the first thing that you read, even if that thing may be actually academic research, because historians, archaeologists, and everyone else get things wrong. And just because one thing proves one piece of evidence proves something, it doesn't make it right. Or if it does make it right, you always need to wonder, well, why haven't we investigated more about this? Or why aren't people wondering about this? And I mean, we could get into that at another point, but usually it's either because the evidence are tenuous or because that thing that you're about to unpack is so mind-blowing that people just haven't built up the courage to change the archaeological record, the historical record, and therefore the way we think about us and about people in the past. So it is very much, it is actually a bit of a minefield, to be honest.
My most used words in all my writing is suggests. You never say, this proves that, or this shows that. You always say, this suggests that, people in the past did this, or this site suggests that maybe this was thing, because that hopefully shows that, like, this is one interpretation of many. Like, this is what I believe based on the evidence. But yeah, like you say, it's even academics, and even, I mean, people referencing texts from the 1950s or something as well. It's like, that's a whole different mind frame. There's been so many changes in thought and everything. And yeah, so it's definitely a minefield for those of you who are watching. I feel like we've been people who are watching who are like vaguely interested in archaeology and now like, oh God, this sounds awful. It's really great.
It is actually really fun. But I think, one of the biggest things that I always take everyone that sort of says, I want to do history, and they want to actually do history for real, not just, I just want to read every single Tudor book that was ever written on the subject and be done. Yeah. Not that I have a problem with that, but that's, that's one very tunnel vision way of seeing history. If you want to do history for the sake of actually understanding human beings throughout time, if you want to do archaeology for the same reasons, you really need to go to it with an open mind. Like you said, you will have your biases, and you need to understand that as much as they will tell you throughout your entire academic profession that you're not allowed to have a bias, you do, period.
Yeah.
So you kind of need to learn to filter things through your bias, but also without it, and be sort of ready to find things that you didn't expect or want to find.
Yeah.
And once you kind of have that mindset, then it is really just like going out on an adventure, because you just don't know what's going to happen, and it's great.
Yeah. It's like a detective book, but you have the last 5 pages are missing, so you don't actually find out for sure what happens. You just have to base it on like what you found.
Exactly that. Oh, that's great. And I'm afraid that these are our time up. In fact, we've already gone 2 minutes over, and I am aware that you have parental duties and other duties to fulfill. So we're going to have to release Matilda today. I'm sorry, guys. But thank you so much for being here. And if you would like to send one final message to the people listening now or later, please take this chance.
Oh gosh, the pressure. Yes, I guess, yeah, I sort of mentioned it before, but I guess hopefully it would be that if you're interested in archaeology, it is a fantastic thing to do, but like she said, keep an open mind. But I think also just try to keep an open mind in general in everyday life as well, and try to picture, okay, this other person that I'm looking at, and this person who was living 5,000 years ago, we're all people and we're all humans. And that's eventually what we're studying as archaeologists and as history, right? Is the human story. So I think that's important to remember, that people in the past were humans as well, and people in the present too. Yeah.
Amen. I mean, that's sort of, that's what we do. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for actually opening our eyes to everything else that we've talked about today, and for actually sharing a little bit of that insider knowledge on Arctic archaeology, because I generally think it's a fascinating field, and hopefully in the future you will have departments full of them, and you'll be like mentoring them, and it would be like awesome. That's what I'm envisioning here. In any case, definitely. I'm projecting this into the future.
Manifest that for me, that would be great.
I'll try. But no, honestly, thank you so much. And guys, as usual, if you ever have any questions about archaeology or history, whatever, both me and any of our guests, Matilda included, we're always ever just so happy to talk about this stuff, because like this is literally what we live for. So, don't be strangers. Feel free to drop us messages, comment, etc. And we will always be very happy to take you on these adventures with us. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you once again, Matilda, for being awesome, first of all, and secondly, for being here. And keep on following her reels, because they're amazing, and you will learn so much.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
That's all right. My pleasure. Take care now. Bye-bye.